I want to talk about the crisis of grief personally, and also mindful that it touches many in our culture, particularly men. Unable to form emotional attachment to either parents. The first grief was the death of the empathic personality, the death of the innocence that wants to bond and connect. The second violations or wave came when the woman who I was most able to bond with, my teacher in first, second, and part of third grade, when she died in a car accident. And I remember the dissociative feeling of, it was almost a euphoric numbness. And shortly after that, I was expelled for being disruptive in class. And it seems almost mind-numbingly cruel, looking back, that as a result of no grown-ups or adults being able to model emotional connection as a consequence of traumatic illiteracy, meaning that these intense feelings that are silenced and shamed with disowning, with dishonor, with dissociation, have to move through the body in some way. And like so many facets of our culture, the inability of the grown-ups to empathize or respond is transferred to the child as a form of shame. You have a learning disability. You are hyperactive, as opposed to, we do not know how to feel. We do not know how to bond. We do not know how to grieve. We certainly can't model that in you, but we discourage your feelings, which risk inducing feelings of our own we're uncomfortable feeling. And rather than mourn the absence of that felt human experience, we shame you, we blame you for doing the best you can in a trauma-illiterate culture. The next loss was my cat. At 8 and 9 years old, this animal was more empathic, was more stable, was more capable of bonding to me than anyone around me. This animal didn't humiliate, didn't shame me, did not abandon me, did not threaten me. And there was something lost when Dad announced that we were moving. And of course, I was worried about losing the cat. He made up some lie about the cat will take care of the cat, and then just left the cat out in the wilderness. As so many traumatic events, as if nothing had occurred. When I reminded him of various broken promises, he flew into a rage, angry at me for having any attachment to either things or the animal. By that time, I had also developed an attachment to things as more stable than human beings, as more honest. They didn't lie, they didn't suddenly contort themselves and behave differently on a day-to-day basis. One of the saddest things that I've experienced is the turning away by the grown-ups in our cult from truths that hurt the child and make them uncomfortable. These truths were never welcome. But in communicating this on so many different levels, what was really not welcome was my felt feminine self, my personality, what I saw, what I felt. What was being discarded was who I identified with as being. And this was compounded by severe emotional humiliation, torment, the grandiosity of the parent in so many levels, communicating, you don't matter, you are small, you cannot fight us. It entertains us to see you suffer. You do not matter. We matter. You don't have power financially, emotionally. You cannot say what is true for you because we will punish you and we will humiliate you for the feelings of grief, trauma, and helplessness that this brings up. By the time I was 13, the helplessness that I felt about being jerked around as the emotional yo-yo to give gratification and power, primarily to my father, was such that I lost all affect in my voice. I remember cultivating consciously. It was the way I framed it when I developed this mask at 12 was I recognized that any ounce of emotion displayed in the family system would be manipulated, would be contorted, would be tormented, would be humiliated, and thrown back in my face. And I realized that passive-aggressive coward that my father was, he was about 6 years old emotionally and at least as tormented as I was from his own childhood. I realized that because violence was an undercurrent, and because I would be shocked, hurt, and frightened at a confrontation which I was bound to lose, that I could not compete and advocate for my emotional dignity. The only thing that I could do if I wanted to resolve the helplessness of being yo-yoed up and down for my father's amusement, and then humiliated for the helplessness that this induced, was to put on a poker face and to have as little engagement with the family as possible. I realized that it was my care for my siblings. I was the eldest of 5. My care for justice, my care for truth. I realized that this was the hook that was being used to first pull me out, and then, having committed myself emotionally to something, be used to display my helplessness, I guess would be a way to put it. I realized that that there was a leaning forward into the energy of being emotionally involved with the family that was the hook that could then be wound around to leave me laying on the floor, feeling helpless, feeling humiliated, and feeling hooked, hooked in. And this was the kind of the end game of my father, to reduce other people to the same level of helplessness and grief as himself. And of course, I had no models to grieve, so this accumulated layers upon layer upon layer of grief and betrayal just built up in the body. And there was no grown-up, no adult who would grieve what was being stripped layer by layer away. The innocence, the enthusiasm, the spontaneity, everything feminine, layer by layer by layer being stripped away, to a point where, because helpless humiliation was the greatest pain and the greatest trauma and the greatest shame, because at the same time, in the emasculating chauvinism of the cult, boys are not supposed to get upset. Boys are not supposed to cry. And there were no tears by an adult for this grief, for this betrayal on a daily basis, whether it was myself or watching the same thing. My siblings didn't pull out emotionally. And so I got to witness, having pulled out, the machinations to bring each of them down to their lowest common denominator, into that helplessness, which was another form of grief, to understand that I couldn't inject myself into that system without being hooked. I could simply come back. Part of what helped me at that moment was to start calling my parents Michael and Sherilyn. And the construct that I created was, imagine that these people were people I had just met. They weren't my parents. They were just average grown-ups. My father could be witty and tell interesting stories, often at other people's expense. My mother probably wouldn't bother me particularly just because she wasn't present and wasn't there emotionally, but that wouldn't bother me particularly if I just met them on the street as a teenager. I thought they're about average. And the key is, rather than relating to them as the negligent, disappointing parents that they are, to relate to them as average human beings who I wouldn't particularly dislike any more than than other average human beings, none of whom were particularly loyal or emotionally available or invested in my well-being any more than my parents. These were just people. And I also always understood that my father's approaches to me was because he wanted something. And it was painful to have this veneered with his, feigned concern. I think the lies are the most painful thing, because it's easier to deal with cruelty if someone says, I hate you, I want to hurt you, but I don't want to look too bad doing it, and so I'm going to do it in a covert way. because I don't want to look like a jerk, basically. Then I could say, fine, okay, so how are you going to hurt me today without looking bad or whatever? And, and that's sane. There's an understanding that's consistent with the behavior. But to have all this doctored up as I'm really concerned about you and this, it just felt, do I have to pretend to be appreciative of the concern that you need to believe is real? I'm not. I'm wary at your approach. And so I developed a transactional format with Michael. He would approach every now and again, less frequently over time, because he never came out after this approach looking particularly good. And I would say, Michael, what do you want? He would say, what do you mean, what do I want? I'm just concerned about you. Okay, thank you. So are we done now? And of course, he wanted something. And I'd say, okay, so what is it? Yes, I will cooperate with that. No, I will not. What is it that you're going to give me for this? Because in a sociopathic paradigm, a sociopath does not give to you because you need something. That would be empathic. They give to you because they want something. It's sociopathic. And so the power dynamic was already stacked enough such that if there was something I genuinely needed for my well-being, etc., this would be an opportunity to negotiate for it and have some sense of dignity in the interaction. The New Age movement, of course, talks about being positive, and this was my direction when I left home at 17, Success with a Positive Mental Attitude by Norman Vincent Peale and Napoleon Hill. Interestingly, Norman Vincent Peale was one of Trump's mentors. And the amount of unsung and unmourned grief leaving my younger siblings in a system I could do nothing about is immense. And I marvel at the cult's complicity in invisible grief. I don't think any grown-up in this cult has ever asked me if I knew how to grieve or if I needed help and hand-holding to grieve with them what might be too difficult to grieve alone. The cement on it was the humiliation and the shame for feeling in the cult that denigrates the feminine. To be in this amount of pain and to know that what was given dignity in this cult, my money, my intellect, my articulating talent, the fact that I've achieved thousands of goals, this gave me rank. Emotions deranked me. I felt so small, so hurt already, that to go into feelings in a cult that denigrates and dishonors feelings systematically, that to lose rank just by going into feelings was too hard. To be that small and to be looked down at for going into the feeling of smallness, such that I would be made even smaller for having the courage to feel those feelings, was too hard. And so I've stored this in my body, creating massive amounts of fatigue over time, large amounts of energy suppressing those tears and emotions, large amount of energies wanting to release them. That framework of chauvinistic shame. And I've always loved women who could cry, because I knew they had something that was very hard for me to access. And I knew it was valuable. I would often feel relief on the other side of their tears and admire them for their strength to bring up the feelings that were so shy, were so hesitant to come out. As a sensitive, one of my biggest fears was violent shock. And so I've developed an instinct to avoid conflict in a lot of areas. Because it brings up feelings in an environment where I don't know how to deal with them, and the people around me systematically dishonor them. And so it just feels cruel. It feels cruel to bring states of consciousness forward that no one in the environment knows how to honor. The rule in my family was, "Thou shalt not feel." But this is a rule shared by many in our culture. The law of empathy dictates that whoever is having the strongest feelings be pivoted around, that others attune to the strongest feeling in the space. But this is violated constantly, and I find myself feeling smaller as I bring up feelings that, to me, are worse than death. Dying is not a big deal. Having these feelings be dishonored by everyone around me and not knowing how to honor them myself is a big deal. I don't know whether to feel angry, disgusted, sad, or just burst out laughing at the incompetence to respond to feelings in our cult. I have watched so many conversations skip above the feelings. Someone brings up a feeling. Chris Wallace did it to Andrew Yang just the other day, asking Andrew how he felt about the molestation of his wife by his doctor while he was out campaigning. Having invited deep humanity with a completely impassive poker face, he then interrupted the answer to move on to more interesting things in the interview. And the amount of wounding that has to go on before a reporter can do that to another human being is immense. And it mirrors the amount of self-wounding that has to go on before one can follow the sociopathic jumping in the conversation. One of the greatest gifts of my wife is she's not afraid to show all these feelings on her face all the time. And while I cannot care for these feelings in myself, I get to learn how to love the feminine, how to love feelings, how to care for feelings by noticing the ripple effects, the alive movement in voice, in tears, in face, and learning to attune and learning to love and learning to serve. It's an incredible honor. And she, loving her feminine self, helps me learn to be human. And it is treated with the same dishonor. You know, it's like, this is my tether to humanity, to the empathic levels of the brain. And my government took my tax money to deny her access to my home, to my country, for over a year, with a level of sociopathic disregard that is a murderous offense. When you lose your humanity, a grandfather given PTSD in the Second World War, a father given PTSD with the traumas at home, a child given complex PTSD shortly after language, and then have that rape be cemented. If I could walk out my door and see people weeping about this level of cruelty, I would feel at home. I would feel that I was among human beings. But I walk out into the same masks that I don to survive, and I do not feel welcome as a human being. I feel alone. In my adult life, it is the positive parts of me, the empathic parts of me, that are cut down, unwanted, uninvited, discouraged, that hurt me the most. Because in a numb and sociopathic state, I lack access to the aggression needed to advocate for the dignity of the feminine self inside and out. In a cult that thinks nothing of the rape on an hourly basis of the soul that is still bleeding on the edge of ice, on the edge of freezing, but still bleeding. When a little bit of that coldness thaws away, there is blood waiting, not warmth. And it's too painful to feel at full volume, so it's on ice. The pain of ice, the protection of numbness. On the other side is grief. The next joke is the adaptive side is welcome. I know what this cult wants of me, to be welcome, and it is an adaptation. It is a fiction. It is a lie. The first time I carefully planned my suicide and weighed options at around age 14. It's an obvious thing. Everything that you are is not welcome. Everything that you are not is elevated. If you don't want me, I'll leave. I don't like pretending to be what you need me to be, and then pretending that I like that, and then pretending that nothing's going on, and then pretending that all of that is no big deal. Death marks a grave of the soul that has already happened. Why not tell the truth and realize the murder? If all you can see is a body, why not give you mine? It's harder to lie with a corpse. At least I don't have to carry your need for me to lie and pretend I do not exist for your comfort, to allay your dis-ease. The double side is honored. The absence of grief creates a crisis of violence. There is the violence of dissociation, the violence of trauma. There is the violence of abandonment. There is the violence of humiliation. There is the violence of complicit silence, the complete and utter stillness. As the innocence of the infant is cut down and left in the snow, and people walk around as if no thing has happened. There's so much violence. And the pain is too big for one individual to deal with. But where do you turn to when the projected deity of the cult is more sociopathic than the father? Where do you reach to when the mythological ecosphere is populated by sociopathic, narcissistic giants of a cruel and sadistic, egotistical nature? The whole Christian mythology is a mythology of betrayal, a mythology of suffering, of loneliness, of isolation. God can't even pick up a fucking cell phone and have direct communication for some of the many confusing missives. One of the things that hurt me the most in this dynamic with Peter Sandhill is that, first of all, the psychedelics soften the boundary. And in connecting, there is the connection to the transcendent brain and to the wound both. My first psychedelic journey was a possibility to enter the wound. with, I would call it transcendent guidance, in terms of the voice that came through me was not a voice that I recognized, but it was a voice that I believed in. That voice revealed Peter Sandhill's shadow, his denied, sociopathic, narcissistic, betraying faces of self. And so it was not welcome. You're very suggestive in a psychedelic state, and Peter suggested that we not look at his cruelty, and that what came through did not apply to him, and that what he needed was to reenact the abuse cycle. And 10 hours is not enough. There were only about 3 where I had a window of opportunity to see myself and to start navigating. And every single impulse in that domain was undercut, was resisted by my therapist in an incredibly sacred and vulnerable moment. One needs help to go into this grief, into this trauma, and it is not given. That is a betrayal of our humanity. The fact that there are millions of Americans today sitting around bored, overeating, watching media that has little or no meaning other than its diversion from feelings. And none of these grown-ups are available to honor the wound that is in our children, that is in our bodies, that is in me, is a profound betrayal. It doesn't answer the call of the soul. Come home. Feel me. Honor me. See me. Understand that what you do to me, you do to yourselves. What you do to the feminine, you do to yourselves. See me, feel me, grieve my wounds. I am not going anywhere. I'm waiting for intelligence, for empathy, for honor, for love. The people of this cult want an interesting conversation. Interesting in its avoidance of these domains. I've counted the junction points where the person I'm talking with, who has a high regard for me because of my intellect, ignores profound emotional statements and jumps on to trivia and comments about how interesting this and this and this is. Could we talk more about that? And walk over the grave of your mother. Walk over the grave of your heart as if it did not exist. You do not belong here. I will not honor who you are. I am interested in the stepchild of the intellectual mind, a pale comparison of the authentic truth and feeling of a human being. when no one will grieve the wound while adding to its suffering. This pain builds, and with it the anesthetics: blame, hate, shame, guilt, diversion, addiction. There's nothing left to mask the grief. And as an empath, I understand that I am not alone. I understand that at least 40% of the pain that I feel is the ungrieved, unhonored, dishonored, violated pain of those around me. And yet pain is the doorway back to ourselves. Pain alerts us to the wound we are participating in. It is a stepping stone towards healing. The pain must be recognized and brought to the forefront so that it can be addressed and responded to. One of the griefs and paradoxes and humors, depending on when one's this dissociated, there's a dark humor in seeing some of these designs. The traumatized individual reaches for certainty more than anything else, to feel safe. What is most certain in a sociopathic upbringing and cult is the wound itself. The clinging of the ego to the wounded identity is a search for stability in a volatile and insane world. It's an interesting loop. I'm in shock, I'm in dissociation, I don't know who I am, I can't feel. What's the loudest noise in the space? The familiarity of fear, the familiarity of shame, the familiarity of loneliness. I'll cling to that as an identity because it's more stable than the volatile relationships of a fragmented and traumatized cult around me, in which one thing after another is violated and no one even pauses to ask, how much pain did that cause? How did that feel? When there's no opening in the dialogue to ask if the many projections and assumptions have anything to do with what's going on there. There's a particular descent into cruelty that I've layered and marked before I reach the wall around which I need to let the other person know how much pain they're causing me by hurting them. In an empathic culture, a face like this, a body like this, a voice like this is communicating mountains of grief and needs immediate doses of love and empathy. In an addictive and sociopathic cult, no one even notices, and if they do, they withdraw, incapable of responding, and avoid the terrain. I fully understand why people kill themselves, because they have been killed already, and they understand that the sociopaths around them would be more upset with the truth coming out than they would with the slow inner death of lies and silence. I think the most upsetting thing for those around a suicide is the betrayal. Is why couldn't you keep up the facade? It's not hard to see someone. It takes time, a few hours a day perhaps, but that is too much in this cult. It's just too much. That has to be relegated to television. If someone tells me, I think you are like this and feeling this for this reason and this reason, and I'd like to know if that is the case, I can deal with that. It's very easy to say, no, this is the case. 90% of those projections don't land, have nothing to do with what's actually going on. My sister used to say that I was arrogant and aloof. When the opposite is, of course, true. I was too terrified of yet another wave of pain and humiliation to talk about this wound, and being choreographed by my father, she would not have been capable, as she remains incapable, of responding. I spoke with her for 4 hours around a planned suicide, and I counted. There was not a single empathic word that she uttered in 4 hours, discussing suicide and suicidal grief. She's over 40, and she's doing well in this cult by objective, who comes up with these ideas, what is and isn't objective, by cult measures. And I watched her die on the inside. And it's clear that facing her pain is something she's so committed to avoiding, she would happily kill. Or sadly kill if she can feel, if that's what it takes. And she's now having children. I can deal with being hurt and the hurt being acknowledged. I am hurting you. Manageable level of pain. I can deal with being hurt and and it being acknowledged that I fucked up, etc., and I can't deal with, and I'm not gonna I said I would do this and I'm not doing it, etc. There's a certain point in this kind of deterioration of optimal, because optimal is, one, not being hurt additionally, and then secondly, being seen, and then thirdly, out of the seeing, actually being loved and cared about. and going into these feelings. That's optimal. Never happens. Well, I'm doing some healing with with someone. There's an hour out of every 3 hours I spend with this healer where that happens 50%. And that's huge. That's top 1% of 1% of 1% of this lifetime in this cult. 50%, 1/3 of the time of optimal is like, wow, this is incredible. I had no idea I could actually experience that and be alive. The descent away from optimal, okay, I'm not going to be seen, I'm not going to be loved, I'm not going to be honored and helped, I'm going to have this projection, but at least we can talk about the projection. But most of the time people want to project on me and not ask if the projection is true. They then want to act as if the projection is true. Then they want to argue with me that their action is appropriate, again without examining the projection and explaining why the projection is true. And then they want to argue with me that the feelings that I actually have, based on what's true, don't exist and shouldn't exist because I don't apparently know what's going on inside of me. And then the last straw is being asked to empathize with them and their frustration at the fact that the dynamic doesn't work because the actions don't have the desired effect because of a flawed paradigm that cannot be discussed as flawed. And then we can't talk about that either. It's so sad to understand the amount of pain someone else is in and the amount of incompetence our cult renders our people in the ability to bond and connect deeply. And I don't fully understand all of the various veneers. I just know that most of the masks and faces that people wear fall away when I'm with people, down to a point where they get scared and small or belligerently hostile and walk away. This terrain is not prioritized except to avoid, which of course means that I know that my only chance of moving through this terrain, which is telling the truth, is the primary enemy of the people around me and my cult, who will punish me for being in this domain, which is the primary domain because it is the core wound. Who I am is attacked, bullied, punished, shamed, lied about, humiliated, and silenced. And the pain that marks that grave, taboo, un-American, not consistent with positive thinking. If I could only be cheerful, as the soul within each one of us is laid out on our city streets to be run over 500 times a day. If I could only be cheerful about that. I would have joined the club and be welcome on those terms. We're facing this with school shootings. Boys in this state, unable to have any resource to this amount of pain, are asking the country to witness the violations going on inside of them by externalizing them in a dimension that the cult cannot ignore. It may do the wrong thing, of course, because that's what idiotic, sociopathic cults do. Let's call in the military, right? Let's shame the child. But this is our pain. This is our grief. This is our wound. And it cannot be dealt with alone. It requires honor. It requires respect. It requires love, and lots of it. It requires attention. It requires grief to let the mountains of bottled up energy move out into the ecology and heal. Heal the blockages between us and the larger ecology that we are a part of. It requires grief. It requires singing. It requires circling. It requires movement. It requires sound. It requires large amounts of unstructured, spacious time to honor the stone figure, hardened and mummified at the core of the psyche, wound up so tightly for thousands of years, forgotten and trampled over in the feverish drive for possession, for addiction, for sensation, for something to take us out of the grief. Our young boys, our young women can go through 10,000 hours of cult training in and out of school and not receive 30 minutes of truth along these lines. And having been hung out to dry on the cult machinery, we have the audacity to ask them how they're doing and need to hear that they're okay. I just need to hear that you're okay. I'm not okay. I'm not fine. But you do not want to hear that because it guides into the machinery, which has nothing to do at some level with the individual, with each one of us. It has everything to do with the cult, which, like the individual that clings to their deepest pain, their deepest wound, in order to feel safe in the traumatic turbulence of violation, hatred, and betrayal, the cult clings to its norms, its abuse norms, with the tenacious terror of a toddler not wanting to face the unknown because too much pain has happened from the known, And all trauma at some level enters from the unknown. Trauma is too big for the known. It takes us into a transcendent state where it's bigger than the ego and filled with terror. What makes this wound bearable is to talk about its impact. What makes this wound bearable is to understand that it is our wound. Oh, sure, in various stages it can be numbed and denied, and there are other parts of the psyche that are not in pain. But this domain of our collective and individual psyche is in pain if we are awake to it. Because it is out of integrity, it is disintegrated, it is separated, it is wounded by our chauvinism that we live every day, by the loneliness that we conceal as we get another dopamine hit from our phone. There is a construct of this wound held tenaciously to by the cult to help the cult avoid its fear of the feminine, the unknown, the emotions, the depths, the transcendent, the ecological awareness that we are connected with the planet that gave birth to us. To be able to see and feel this wound together is to heal. To partition shame and silence it is an unconscionable cruelty that we give to one another in our silence, in our refusal to see the tapestry that is right in front of us. My parents were about average. Above average in some areas, below average in some areas. I'm not talking about some tiny minority of sick individuals. I'm talking about you. I'm talking about me. I'm talking about us, historically and in the present. I'm talking about how we live our lives day by day.